Hello, everyone. My name is Carla Garrett, and I serve as a project officer on the Good Jobs Challenge program here at the U.S. Economic Development Administration, which will be referred to as EDA throughout this presentation. I am joined by my colleagues, Jasmine Childs-Gunter and Nancy Isle. Today, we're going to take a closer look at the fiscal year 2024 Good Jobs Challenge funding opportunity. We will discuss the programmatic aspects of this non-construction grant in addition to the technical requirements to submit the application. We will start the presentation by highlighting the vision of the Good Jobs Challenge program and reviewing key program components such as the key technology focus areas and the Good Jobs principles. We will then review the required forms that must be included in all applications and provide helpful tips to ensure you double-check the eligibility requirements. The final section will cover additional resources and helpful information regarding match sources and documentation, utilizing the non-construction budget template provided, and submission details. The first awards of the Good Jobs Challenge occurred in 2022 with a $500 million investment into regional workforce training systems that will utilize a sector-based framework to create strong alignment between local industry employers and training institutions with the goal of developing targeted workforce training that leads to a good job for members of the targeted community. The Good Jobs Challenge program aligns with EDA's investment priorities that aim to strengthen local economies by providing American workers with access to good job opportunities that aid in the achievement of economic mobility and security, ultimately making communities more resilient and competitive in a 21st century global economy. This program design and sector-based framework continues on in the current funding opportunity. The fiscal year 2024 Good Jobs Challenge anticipates making approximately 5 to 8 awards to backbone organizations totaling up to $25 million for sectoral partnerships that will train and place program participants into good jobs that advance industries in the federal key technology focus areas. One of the most important components of the fiscal year 2024 funding opportunity is the requirement that all projects must align to a key technology focus area as identified by the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022. It is important to note that prior to formal submission of your application, EDA staff cannot clarify whether your project's focus is within or at the intersection of one or more of the key technology focus areas. EDA expects applicants to clearly align how their projects fall within a single key technology focus area or crosses multiple areas. You can do this by clearly naming the jobs for which you are designing and or implementing your trainings for, clearly stating the key technology focus area your project advances, and providing the data to support. The project narrative provides an allowability of 15 pages for describing your projects. You are strongly encouraged to provide all information deemed necessary to articulate your program's objectives and goals. Here is an example slide of the information that can be included in a project's proposal that helps effectively relay a project's objectives. You can see that the key technology focus area is clearly identified and the complementary occupations are as well. The training model is identified as a work and learn model, and a plan for wraparound supports is stated. Now, this example slide is not intended to be an all-inclusive list, but to provide you an example of how the key points can be called out. Remember, you should strive to provide enough information that helps reviewers assess your applications in alignment with the merit review criteria outlined on page 43 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Another important component of the fiscal year 2024 funding opportunity is the requirement that all projects must align to the Good Jobs Principles. The Good Jobs Principles is a collaborative framework established by U.S. Department of Labor and U.S. Department of Commerce that outlines 8 principles that creates the framework for a shared vision of job quality. These principles help create quality jobs that allow everyone to share in prosperity and support local communities and the entire U.S. economy. Your project should clearly demonstrate alignment with these principles. That can be done by specifically calling out the wages and benefits of the job occupations that will be obtained through your projects, relaying the recruitment and hiring strategies that will be deployed through your project, or through the commitment letters of your sector partnership employers that attest to their commitment. That can also include the work culture that they'll be fostering. We encourage you to review all of the published materials of this funding opportunity and work to provide comprehensive documentation of your proposed projects. Remember to follow the golden rule of do not assume the reviewer knows any leading information about your organization or project. It is your responsibility to work to connect the dots of your project. Required forms for application. All applicants must include the forms outlined here. These forms are outlined in all published materials in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Published in the notice, Published on the Notice of Funding Opportunity website, an applicant checklist is provided that provides links and descriptions of all of the forms found here. We advise promptly reaching out to EDA with any questions about the forms or difficulty accessing the required documents. Conditionally required forms. Now, depending on the type of organization you are or the type of activities you will be proposing may require you to provide additional forms. More details on conditionally required forms can be found in the Notice of Funding Opportunity starting on page 37. Again, if there are any questions on these forms and if they are required for your project, please reach out to EDA promptly. You are also able to provide optional forms. These optional forms can provide additional documentation that supports your project narrative and evidence of membership in an EDA-designated tech hubs. EDA has provided a budget and staffing plan template that can be utilized when fulfilling the requirement of providing a budget narrative and staffing plan. My colleague will discuss this template later in the presentation. Now, I will hand the presentation over to Nancy Isle.
Thank you, Carla. Really appreciate the introduction. And I'm going to talk about eligibility for the grant, because no matter how wonderful your proposal is, you have to be eligible. And I'm going to discuss several tips with you. First, you have to ensure that you're an eligible entity, that your organization is eligible for funding. Eligible applicants for EDA investment assistance under this NOFO include a district organization of an EDA designated Economic Development District, known as EDD, an Indian tribe or consortium of Indian tribes, a state, county, city, or other political subdivision of a state, an institute of higher education, or a public or private nonprofit organization acting in cooperation with the state. So what do you need to do? Depending on the type of organization, you might need to provide documentation to support your status as an eligible entity. And this is in the NOFO. All this information you need is in the NOFO. Next slide, please, Carla. So the next thing to be eligible for funding under this NOFO is you must meet cost share requirements. With limited exceptions, cost share is required for all projects funded under the FY24 Good Jobs Challenge NOFO. The EDA investment rate is 50% of total project costs, which includes match. 50% of total project costs. EDA may be able to fund up to 80% based on regional need and may be able to fund up to 100% if your organization is an Indian tribe. What do you need to do? You have to document cost share according to the NOFO instructions. If you're requesting over 50% of funding from EDA, you must submit documentation that shows the allowable investment rate based on the economic distress of the region. For projects subject to a special need, as outlined in the NOFO, EDA will determine the maximum allowable investment rate. Next slide, please. Another thing your project has to show is that the region the project is in meets EDA's distress criteria on the date that EDA receives the application. This is according to this regulation that's on the slide, 13 CFR 301.3A. The applicant defines the region geographically. There are three ways to meet this economic distress criteria. The first is the proposed project is in a region that meets EDA's economic distress criteria, or the project is in an EDD in a region that doesn't meet the economic distress criteria, but EDA determines the proposed project will substantially directly benefit a geographic area within the EDD that meets the distress criteria, or the project is in a geographic area of poverty or high unemployment that meets EDA's economic distress criteria, but the region overall doesn't meet the distress criteria. And what does the applicant need to do? You must submit third-party data indicating the region is subject to EDA's distress criteria. What is this? It's the unemployment rate. So one or more of the following economic distress criteria must be met. An unemployment rate that is for the most recent 24-month period for which data is available has to be at least 1 percentage point greater than the national average unemployment rate. Or the per capita income for the most recent period where the data is available has to be 80% or less of the national average per capita income, or the region is subject to a special need. And all of this information is in more detail in the NOFO. Next slide, please. Another thing your project must meet is that it must align with a comprehensive economic development strategy, or the CEDS, or an equivalent EDA-accepted regional economic development strategy that shows that the project will meet these strategy requirements. Applications will need to detail how the proposed project will support the economic development needs and objectives as outlined in the CEDS or the equivalent strategy, and also provide a copy of the document or a link to the document. Also, Section 5 of the project narrative, you'll have to describe how the proposed project will be consistent with the region or region CEDS. Next slide, please. The project also must meet EDA's investment priorities to be eligible for funding. EDA evaluates all project applications to determine the extent to which they align with EDA's investment priorities, including EDA's equity investment priority, which we will discuss in one moment. You'll, in Section 5 of the project narrative, have to address how the project will meet EDA's investment priorities. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the EDA expects projects to advance equity to underserved populations to the extent practicable. A successful project will articulate which populations or communities will benefit and include a plan for inclusive community engagement in the project, and ensure that the economic benefits of the project will be shared by all communities in the region, including any underserved community. What would you need to do? In Section 5 of the project narrative, you will need to address how the proposed project will meet EDA's investment priorities, including the equity investment priority. Next slide. And now we'll talk a little bit about match sources and documentation. Because meeting your match share requirements is an eligibility point, I'll talk a little bit about how to meet them. Next slide. And this is all in the NOFO. Applicants must include a commitment letter from each separate match source. These letters must be signed with the authority to commit funds on behalf of the contributing donor or contributing organization, which, by the way, if it's not the applicant, must come from the organization donating the match and must be signed by somebody representing that organization, not the applicant, if it's not the applicant. The letters have to state whether each element of the match contribution is cash or in kind, and if it's in kind, the letters should provide a valuation and description for each element, and this is also described in the NOFO. Confirm that the contribution is from a non-federal source and show that the match is committed unencumbered, and available as needed. Next slide. So kind of to recap, the letters must demonstrate that match is unencumbered, committed to this project, and unrestricted, which is available for use during the period of performance. The signed commitment letters also must include the amount, if it's cash, or valuation, and itemized description of all in-kind donations, a statement that the source is not federal, and a signature from the authorized representative of the donator or the donor organization. Overall match must be directly related to the proposed project, align with eligible costs, and not be provided by a contractor who will be paid with award funding. As I've mentioned, applicants must not pledge match that is contributed by a third-party entity unless that match letter is signed by an authorized representative of that entity. So that's all I wanted to mention about match. More information is in the NOFO. And now I'll turn it over to Jasmine Gunter, who will talk about other important things in this NOFO and requirements.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Nancy. Hello, everyone. My name is Jasmine Child Gunter, and I'm currently the project officer here at the Good Jobs Challenge program. I will explain to you today the use of the non-construction budget template and how to submit your application on EDA's Edge Salesforce system. We will begin with the use of the non-construction budget template. This is a useful tool that we use here at EDA to ensure that we can monitor all programmatic costs that will be effective over the course of this award. A budget template is a budget narrative and staffing plan that is required by EDA. You can find more information as it pertains to a budget template in the NOFO in section D2B2 on page 33. In addition to providing a standalone budget narrative and staffing plan, applicants are strongly encouraged to use the optional budget and staffing plan template available at eda.gov under Good Jobs Challenge resources to supplement the required budget narrative and staffing plan. Next slide, please. Now, to tell you more about a budget narrative and what must be included in your application. Applicants must provide a detailed budget narrative document that identifies and justifies each budget line item, including both the federal share and the non-federal share match. Each line item in the budget narrative should clearly indicate 3 points of focus. 1, the budget category from the SF424A to which the line item corresponds. 2, a description of the intended use of funds for each item. A quick tip, you may utilize the description field to provide detailed information for each budget line item. Essentially, what this means is that this is an opportunity to offer further details of what specific costs are needed for your program to operate with the funding, if awarded, of course. And 3, if matching share is allocated to the given line item, the applicant must have a citation to the one or more commitment letters that documents each relevant matching organization's commitment to provide the matching share of the given line item. Please note, each item of in-kind match must be categorized appropriately within the budget. Examples of this could be included in your contractual costs, your equipment costs, supply costs, or any other direct cost categories that can include additional expenses that may be paid with in-kind match funding. Next slide. On this slide, we indicate the budget line items in which we refer to here at EDA as direct cost categories. These direct cost categories that we anticipate will provide further insight and detailed cost descriptions of how the funding will be allocated throughout your award. Let's begin with personnel. All staffing positions listed by name and title that are proposed to support the project activities should be included within this line item. Please ensure that all positions are supported and found within a staffing plan. Again, we encourage the optional budget template provided by EDA's website in the Good Jobs Challenge resources. And within that Excel workbook, there's a tab specifically used for your staffing plan where you may outline the costs of personnel and fringe there. It will include additional columns for items such as time spent on the award, annual salary, total cost of employee, non-federal share, and project responsibility for each staff role of those that will be working on the project. Next, we have fringe benefits, and this would include the amounts and percentages that comprise fringe benefits as a basis for fringe calculations. This information should be provided to us from your organization's current staff policies. For travel, this line item should detail funds for employee travel as described as allowable in 2 CFR 200.475. For equipment, this should consist of tangible personal property with an anticipated acquisition cost of $10,000 or more per unit. We would like you to identify and describe the relationship of this equipment purchase to the project, in addition to listing the quantity and unit cost per item. An example of equipment would be a robotic simulator for $40,000. The supplies line item also includes costs for tangible personal property. However, this pertains to costs that are less than $10,000 per unit. As with equipment, we would like you to also identify and describe the supply cost relationship to the project and list the quantity and cost per item. An example of a supply cost would be like a laptop for $1,000. Moving on to the contractual line. For contractual, this line should consist of all contracts and subawards. For contractors, please ensure that all procurements for goods and services that they are compliant with the federal procurement requirements at 2 CFR 200.317 through 2 CFR 200.327. Here is where you'll find a list of all contractors that will be working on the project, as well as all subawards that will potentially be working on the project. Additionally, subawards must be an eligible entity subject to EDA approval. This also requires a separate budget breakdown, in which I will address in just a bit. Our final direct cost category that we see here is labeled Other. This category is very special and should only be used for direct costs that cannot be categorized as personnel, fringe, travel, equipment, supplies, or contractual. Next slide, please. In addition to our direct cost categories, we also have an indirect cost category. Indirect costs are expenses that are necessary for the organization's general operations, but are not easily associated with a specific grant or project. They are known as facilities and administrative costs, also known as F&A, and or overhead costs. Some key items to note with claiming indirect costs are to identify if the applicant has a NICRA. What is a NICRA? I'm glad you asked. A NICRA is a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. If the applicant does not have a NICRA, then the applicant should include a statement in its budget narrative that it does not have a NICRA available. If desired, the applicant may choose to use the 15% de minimis. The 15% de minimis is based off of modified total direct costs as defined by 2 CFR 200.1, but not over the entire project budget. If the 15% de minimis rate is selected, it must be consistently used for all federal awards, not just this current award. In addition, an additional option for you is that you can have a certificate of indirect costs. This is only applicable to units of government that receive less than 35 million in direct funding. Next slide. Circling back to our direct cost categories and that contractual line item where we mentioned subrecipients or subawards within the Encourage Budget Template Workbook, this is the subaward tab where you can include the subaward corresponding budget and staffing plan, as it will be a component in the project's budget narrative. Here is an example of an outlay that can be used to provide additional details for your subaward funding. Next slide. We also asked to include a staffing plan, and which is also a part of your budget narrative. This will include your key personnel. These are your decision makers. They oversee the scope of work for your deliverables. A pro tip here is to list the name and title of the staff by functional area. Only the applicant's own staff may be listed in the staffing plan. TBDs are okay if you don't have the roles filled, but just ensure that the unfilled position's title are listed until you can fill that role. The staffing plan should also include their annual salary, their rate percent of annual hours for the project, annual funds from the award, the number of years that they'll be working on this award, the total cost by employee or the position, and total fringe based off of your organization's written policy. Next slide. And here is the budget narrative checklist to ensure that you have everything you need to become a potential awardee. Complete the budget narrative section of your proposal. We encourage you to please utilize the 3 C's. 1, compliance. Ensure that your submissions comply with the guidance and the NOFO. Number 2, consistency. Check with the amounts provided and ensure that they correspond with the totals listed in the budget narrative, the SF424, the SF424A, and across all inputs of the proposal. Number 3, capture the match. Verify that the funding sources you cite meet EDA's eligibility criteria previously described and ensure that each source has a corresponding commitment letter. Next slide. I will now transition to the resources for submitting your application in the EDA Edge Salesforce system. Next slide, please. Accessing your application in Edge, you want to go to the link provided here at sfgrants.eda.gov/s/. You want to click the Learn More FY 2024 Good Jobs Challenge. Next slide. Once you get there, you'll be logging into Edge. And under Program Details, you will log into the system and create a profile. Next slide. Here's where you will create a project title that describes your project and proposed work that you'll be completing in your region. Make it a good one. Next slide. Your team members will be listed here by clicking Add Team Member. You want to make sure that this is also the assignment spot for all of your key personnel and decision makers on this grant. Next slide. Knowing your role is super important. Only the authorized representative can submit the funding. And so you want to make sure that this is a person with authority to your program that will be able to make major decisions for your project. Lastly, fill out the SF424. This is the basic application for federal assistance awards. Filling out this form will allow you to also fill out other documents. Next slide. We hope that all of this information was insightful. We also have additional resources for your assistance that can be found here. You'll find the funding request quick reference guide, video tutorials, additional Edge tutorials, and if you need additional assistance with the Edge platform, please contact the Edge Help Desk at granthdsupport@eda.gov. Next slide. Here you find our FY 2024 Good Jobs Challenge resources for planning for the grant and where you can find our NOFO, our frequently asked questions, a one-page summary, the optional budget narrative and staffing plan that we previously mentioned and encouraged for you to use, the resource guide, the application checklist, and our Good Jobs Challenge NOFO stakeholder overview recording and presentation from August 8th this year. At any time that you may have any additional questions regarding this program, please send all email inquiries to goodjobschallenge@eda.gov. Remember that the deadline for submission is 4:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on September 27, 2024. Proposals or the applications received after this deadline, unfortunately, will not be reviewed and considered. In closing, we know that this was a lot of information. However, we hope that this information was very helpful to you. We wish you the best of luck in applying to the Good Jobs Challenge 2024 Notice of Funding Opportunity and look forward to potentially working with you in the future. We thank you so much for your time today. From the Good Jobs Challenge team, have a great day.